In today's video, we're going to be taking a look at a series of brand new cloud gateways from Ubiquiti. The UniFi Express 7 or UX7, the UniFi Dream Router 7 or UDR7, and the UniFi Cloud Gateway Fiber or UCG Fiber. And just to be completely upfront, Ubiquiti have sent me these free of charge to try out, but they haven't told me anything to say and they haven't paid me anything to make this video. But just in case you see the include paid promotions thing switched on this video, that's what that means. So what we have here are three new UniFi Cloud Gateway devices, and these are essentially an all-in-one unified device. So that means each of these devices runs the UniFi network application to manage everything. They also each act as their own gateway or firewall, so they each act as their own little all-in-one router. And in the case of the UX7 and the UDR7, also incorporate Wi-Fi 7 access points. It's a similar idea to the likes of a UniFi Dream machine, except with these, they're a much smaller form factor, and they're designed for places maybe where you don't want a massive comms rack and a full-on rack mount device. Instead, you want something that can maybe sit in the corner of a room, sit on a desk, sit on a shelf, and look a bit more aesthetically pleasing. And for that, these devices are absolutely fantastic. I can see these being really useful and really desirable in a lot of small home settings or even in small businesses where you don't have a massive comms rack, you don't have massive amounts of structured cabling, but you just want some neat little devices to get you into the UniFi ecosystem that can then be extended with other UniFi devices without needing any huge rack mount equipment. Now, if at first glance these devices look somewhat familiar, that's because each of these devices is essentially an upgraded version of an existing UniFi product. The UniFi Express 7 is an upgraded version of the original UniFi Express. The UniFi Dream Router 7 is an upgraded version of the original UniFi Dream Router, and the Cloud Gateway Fiber is an upgraded version of the Cloud Gateway Max. And with each of these devices, they're generally upgraded with more processing power and better connectivity. So each of these devices has been upgraded with both 10 gig Ethernet and multi-gig Ethernet ports, and the devices with built-in Wi-Fi have now been upgraded to Wi-Fi 7. So what we'll do in this video is we'll take a look at each of these devices in turn, take a look at the hardware, and then we'll do some performance tests. So first up, let's take a look at the UniFi Express 7. And this is kind of the most entry-level device in this lineup. And it's a really good option for a lot of home environments or small environments where you're kind of just looking for an upgraded version of almost like a consumer mesh system. Because this device can not only work as a UniFi Cloud Gateway where it acts as a firewall and runs a UniFi network application, these can also just be used as UniFi wireless access points. So what this means is you could, for example, have multiple of these dotted around your house and have them all work together and have the remote access points either uplink to this over a wireless mesh, or you can hardwire them. Or you can even use these as wireless access points with other UniFi devices. It's a really neat device, especially if you're looking for a sort of access point in this form factor. So as you can see, it looks very similar to the original UniFi Express. It's a fairly small form factor device, nice little screen on the front that shows status information, and then around the back we can see the connectivity. And here you can see one of the main upgrades over the previous UniFi Express. So what we have here is we have obviously USB-C for power, reset button, and a pair of Ethernet ports. But unlike the previous UniFi Express, where these were both just gigabit ports, what we now have is a 10 gig port and a 2.5 gig port. By default, the 2.5 gig port is assigned as a LAN port, and the 10 gig port is assigned as the WAN port, but this is reassignable, so you can kind of change this based on your sort of settings. And at first glance, it does seem a little bit weird, the idea of having a 10 gig WAN port when you've only got a 2.5 gig LAN port, and to be honest, it still is a little bit weird. This could be useful for certain situations, for example, where maybe you've got a 2.5 gig internet connection, but the equipment that your ISP hands that off on, some sort of ONT for example, might have an Ethernet port that can only link at 10 gig. Or of course, if you wanted to reassign these, you could reassign the 10 gig port to be a LAN port and then uplink that to a 10 gig switch and have higher speed sort of 10 gig performance for going between different VLANs. However, the thing to bear in mind with this is not only do you have the 2.5 gig LAN Ethernet port, you also have the built-in Wi-Fi. And while it sounds a bit weird saying that, well, the 10 gig port actually does benefit the built-in Wi-Fi, but wait till you see the Wi-Fi performance test later, because the Wi-Fi 7 in this can actually go beyond 2.5 gig speeds. It's absolutely incredible. Now, of course, that's in very idealistic scenario testing, but I was able to get beyond 2.5 gig speeds over Wi-Fi, so actually, I have actually had the benefit of that 10 gig port. But yep, that's connectivity on the back there. And that is UniFi Express 7. Next up in the range, we have the UniFi Dream Router 7, which is of course an upgrade of the original UniFi Dream Router. So of course has a bit of a different form factor, and the main difference is it has additional connectivity. So you see on the front, we've got a little screen there, ring around the top lights up blue, and if we take a look around the back, we can see we have a lot more connectivity on it. So what we have here is we have 4 2.5 gig LAN ports, three 2.5 gig LAN ports, a 2.5 gig WAN port. Of course, these are reassignable. One of these LAN ports also has PoE, and then you have a 10 gig SFP plus connection that, as you can see by default, is also designated a WAN port. But of course, these are completely reassignable. So if you had a 10 gig switch, you could reassign this 10 gig secondary WAN port to be a LAN port and uplink it into your 10 gig switch over 10 gig, which would be really useful. Now, one PoE port is really useful to have if you want to uplink this into another access point. So say you have this downstairs acting as an access point and then a secondary access point upstairs uplinked over PoE. It is a slight downgrade over the previous Dream Router, which had 2 PoE ports, but I suspect there's maybe a technical limitation as to why they've had to do that. But it is really nice having that. And what that also means is you could then use this to uplink to another switch. So for example, here we have a little UniFi Switch Flex Mini 2.5 gigs. This is one of their new 2.5 gig switches that can be powered over PoE. So if you were to take that, plug that into there, that into the PoE port on that would power this switch, give you 4 more Ethernet ports, and then that would all be powered from a single power supply to the UniFi Dream Router. So it's nice to have a single PoE port. It would be nice to have more, but for a device like this, for a lot of home users where generally it's probably going to be used mostly over Wi-Fi, that's at least nice to have. Next up, in terms of power supply, we have a built-in power supply this time. So it just takes a standard IEC sort of figure of 8 connector to power it, so you don't need an external power brick. And then the final thing you'll see here is a micro SD card slot. And that's because this can run UniFi Protect. So if you had, say, UniFi cameras around your house, you could then use this as an NVR. So if you open that up, you can actually see that by default, it will include a 64 gig micro SD card. So what's nice is it actually does come with a WD Purple micro SD card. So this is a micro SD card designed for sort of video recording, CCTV, dash cam type use. It's not just a cheap standard micro SD card. So it's good to see that. And of course, you could upgrade this if you wanted more capacity. Now, with 64 gig or really any device using a micro SD card, you're not going to be getting tons of capacity for continuously recording a bunch of cameras day and night, but it gives you enough capacity to kind of really record motion events. So if you've got a few cameras around your house and you want to be able to locally record motion events to a device like this, you could use that micro SD card and it'll work. So it's nice to have this, a very entry-level device to get into the UniFi Protect ecosystem. And now here we have the final device in the range, which is the UniFi Cloud Gateway Fiber. And this is now getting into the realm of the sort of device you might use in a small office environment. So you potentially, if you just want a small office environment, a few devices hardwired, a couple of access points, nothing too complicated, and you don't have a comms rack, this device looks absolutely fantastic. So this device is wired only. It doesn't have a built-in access point, so you'd use an external access point, but it's got much more connectivity than the existing UniFi Cloud Gateway Max. So on the front, you've again got a little screen, again shows the same status as all the other devices, but then around the back, we can see we have a bunch more connectivity. So what you have on this is, once again, you have 4 2.5 gig LAN ports, and again, one of these has PoE+, so again, you could use that to power an access point or a little switch like this one, so that would be pretty neat. You then also have 3 10 gig ports. So 2 of those are 10 gig SFP+, and then a 10 gig RJ45 port, so for 10 gig base T. Now, based on the standard assignments, the 10 gig RJ45 and one of the SFP Plus ports are designated as WAN ports, and then the other SFP Plus is designated as a LAN port, but it's completely reassignable. So if, for example, you had a 10 gig NAS and then wanted to run a cable, running a standard RJ45 cable that runs through your building to, say, a workstation that you wanted to connect over 10 gig, you could then reassign this 10 gig RJ45 port to be a LAN port and use it like that. So it is all reassignable. So realistically, I kind of view the port assignments on this just like a kind of guide for when you're first connecting it up. You know what to connect initially to get it working, and you can always reassign them later. But it is really nice to have all that connectivity, especially 10 gig RJ45 or 10 gig base T, because being able to either run it through existing structured cabling in a building or connect a workstation directly into that is really, really useful. Then, as I mentioned like before, you have a single PoE Plus port. It would have been nice to have more, but I suspect there's a reason that they couldn't do it without significantly increasing the costs or the hardware size or something like that. But this connectivity is really, really cool. In terms of power, it uses a DC barrel jack, so obviously this is potentially a bit more of a powerful device. It doesn't run over USB power, but 54 volt barrel jack, and obviously includes a power brick, so that's all fine. And then the final thing we have on this, if we look around this side, is this bay here for an SSD for UniFi Protect. So this is the same as the Cloud Gateway Max. It allows you to install an SSD for UniFi Protect. So rather than relying on something simple like a micro SD card, you can get a lot more capacity for your recordings. So to test this out, I have a UniFi SSD here. So this is a 1 terabyte model. You have the option to either buy pre-assembled UniFi SSDs like this, or you can just buy the caddy itself for a fairly low price, I think about £12 or something like that, and put your own NVMe SSD in it. And of course, you did buy one of their SSDs like this, and you wanted to upgrade it down the line, you can actually just take the SSD out and put a different one in. So that's the SSD we have there, which is the 1TB model, and then it comes with a little eject tool as well. And if we push this into the little slot here, it pops out this little plastic plug like that. And then we take the SSD, slide it in like that, and that is now in the device. Now, in some ways, I would have rather seen it come with a caddy rather than plastic plug, but equally, it's just a cost-saving measure, and you know what I mean, it reduces the price of the device for people who don't want to use the built-in UniFi Protect capability, which is probably quite a lot of people. But yeah, that SSD is now in there. If you want to take it out, you just pop that in again, pops that out, and then you can just take it out like that. So this device now has a terabyte of storage space for recording UniFi Protect footage. So that is really, really nice. So yeah, that's UniFi Cloud Gateway Fiber. And this is a really, really nice device. I think this is the device I'm most excited for out of this, because I could see this being really useful in a lot of small business environments that don't have a comms rack, but still want decently powerful network hardware. Now, the final thing I want to quickly mention with this hardware is just something to bear in mind, is that these devices do all contain active cooling fans. Now, in terms of noise level, they are really, really quiet. It's not something that's bothered me at all. It was more a case where I've had them on and the fans maybe kicked in, I've wondered, oh, there's a really weird, very quiet noise in the room, what's that? And I've realised it's the fan in these running. So the fan noise is not a problem at all personally. I can really best describe it as maybe like a laptop fan. So if you've got like a laptop sitting, you know, on a table away from you, and the fan maybe happens to ramp up just a little bit, not much at all, not like where it's like taking off, just the fan just starts running, that's the kind of noise you really get from these devices. So in any kind of room that's not completely silent, you won't notice it at all. It's maybe the sort of thing, I wouldn't maybe put one of these on your bedside table because you might hear it if the fan kicked in. But even in like a living room, you're not going to notice the fans. But I just wanted to mention that these do have active cooling fans, just so you know to expect that. But yeah, they're really, really quiet. It's equivalent to a laptop running its fan at a low speed, really. So there you go. That was like the hardware of each of these devices. What we'll now do is we'll take a look at the performance test. So we'll do a wired performance test of each of these devices. And then after that, we'll jump in and we'll take a look at the wireless performance of the UniFi Express 7 and the UniFi Dream Router 7. So first up on the performance tests, we have the UniFi Express 7. And then because I don't have a multi-gig internet connection, I've only got a gigabit connection, I'm going to be doing all the performance tests to a local open speed test server that I'm connected to over a 10 gig network. So realistically, this speed test can easily max out at 10 gig, so any performance results we get here will be fully testing the full performance of each device. When it comes to the UniFi Express 7, the WAN connection is connected at 10 gig, and then this laptop is connected at 2.5 gig. So we're not going to see beyond 2.5 gig here, but it'll be interesting to see what this can fully do. And then for each of these performance tests, the first test we do will have IDS and IPS disabled, and then for the second test, I'll enable IDS and IPS and just kind of leave it on the auto settings to see if that makes a difference. So let's test this out. So we're all connected up, so let's go and see what we get. So for download, takes a little second to ramp up. We're 2.1, 2.2 gig, just over 2.2 gig, 2.24 sort of gig. Pretty good, pretty good. Now for upload, we're going to get faster, so we're going to get 2.4. Yeah, basically maxing out 2.5 gig Ethernet on the upload. That is pretty good speeds for such an inexpensive, simple little device. And especially in places like the UK where we're starting to get multi-gig internet connections, they aren't really going as high as 2.5 gig, but I think you can now get 1.2 gig and maybe 1.7 gig from some providers. This device would be absolutely perfect for those. And now we're back where I've enabled IDS and IPS, so I've enabled both of them, set it to notify and block, and also just kind of left everything else as default, and then I've also rebooted the device in between tests. So now let's test this out and see what we get. 2 gig, 2.1, 2.2, yep, 2.2 we're hitting, so basically the same sort of download performance as we saw before. Then when it comes to the upload speed, again, hitting 2.4 gig, we're basically getting the exact same performance with IDS and IPS enabled, which is pretty impressive. It's good to see that turning on IDS and IPS doesn't really negatively impact the performance, it seems. Seems pretty good. And it's also worth bearing in mind that with this testing here, we're not actually being able to really max out the full performance of this device, because of course we're being limited by that 2.5 gig LAN connection. Realistically with this device, you could have a 2.5 gig LAN connection and have one or more Wi-Fi 7 clients connected that can actually get very close to or even beyond 2.5 gig speeds. So it potentially could be doing even more than this. And we're back. And this time we've got the UDR7 set up. So like before, we've got the similar connection set up. So we're uplinked to my main network at 10 gig. This time, because the UDR7 has an SFP plus 10 gig port, I've ended up having to use a SFP plus to RJ45 adapter. They're not the best things in the world. They do tend to run quite hot, but they'll be fine for this testing. So we're uplinked over 10 gig, and then the laptop is once again plugged into 2.5 gig Ethernet. So once again, if we run the speed test, this is again with IDS and IPS disabled, see what we get. As you can see, we're again easily saturating 2.5 gig. So we are maxing out a 2.5 gig Ethernet connection on this. So yep, comfortably hitting 2.5 gig down, and then for the upload speed, same thing, comfortably hitting 2.5 gig up. So yeah, that is absolutely fine. So there we go, 2.5 gig down and up. But of course, with the UDR7, we have multiple 2.5 gig interfaces. So what I'll do now is I'll get a second laptop in, we'll connect them both up at the same time and run 2 tests in parallel to see what speed we can get in that case. Okay, so now we've got 2 separate laptops connected up, both over 2.5 gig Ethernet. So we've got the framework laptop as before using the 2.5 gig NIC here, and then the MacBook Pro is connected up using this Thunderbolt 3 10 gig NIC that can also support 2.5 gig, so that's also linked to 2.5 gig. So now we have 2 laptops linked in at 2.5 gig into the UDR7 that's uplinked to the network at 10 gig. So let's see what we can do if we run 2 tests in parallel. So there we go, it's both tests now running. And as we can see, both laptops are comfortably hitting 2.5 gig speeds. So that's obviously the download test, we'll see what the upload is as well, I suspect it'll be the same. So that shows that with this, even though you don't have a single 10 gig LAN port that you could use in conjunction with a 10 gig WAN port, you can only use the port for either WAN or LAN. If you did have a 10 gig connection, you could actually use it between multiple clients and actually get the benefit of it. That's really pretty impressive that this thing is happily routing 5 gig easily. And it could possibly go even faster than that. I've just not got enough laptops and multi-gig network adapters to test with. But as we can see here, it can comfortably handle 2 separate clients running full speed at 2.5 gig. Okay, so now I'm back after enabling IDS and IPS and rebooting UDR7. So like before, the settings I've configured for IDS and IPS, I've just left them mostly as default, and I've set it to notify and block. So now let's test this. So we've got, again, both laptops set up, run the same test on both. And as we can see, once again, we are saturating the 2.5 gig Ethernet connection. So even with IDS and IPS enabled, this is still easily able to sustain 2.5 gig to 2 different clients at the same time. The performance of this is actually really impressive. So now it's time to test the final device out of the lot, which is the Cloud Gateway Fiber. And I'm really excited to try this one out, because this is the first device out of the set that has multiple 10 gig interfaces, meaning we can truly get 10 gig throughput on this to a single client. So in terms of connectivity, on the back, we have the 10 gig RJ45 connection connected up to my main network at 10 gig, and I've connected the 10 gig SFP plus port into the laptop using that adapter again. Of course, again, completely reassignable. I've just kind of left the ports at their default assignment for this testing. And then using the Thunderbolt 10 gig NIC connected into the laptop, and let's run a test and see what we get. And this is with IDS and IPS disabled. And as you can see, give it a second there, we go to ramp up. We're basically able to hit a 10 gig connection. And to be honest, I think we're starting to hit the CPU limitation of the laptop rather than hitting a limitation of this. We're quite comfortably hitting 10 gig. The upload speed is a little bit slower, and I noticed the same on a different laptop as well. So the upload speed is maybe a little bit lower, about 90 gig, or sorry, about 9 gig, but that is still extremely impressive. This device is basically completely capable of routing 10 gig connections. Okay, and we're back after reboot with IDS and IPS enabled, so let's run the test again. And it's very similar to what we've seen with all the other devices. It quite comfortably handles IDS and IPS at a really high speed, so that seems to be 10 gig-ish with IDS and IPS enabled. Now, of course, one thing to bear in mind with both the Cloud Gateway Fiber and the UDR7 is because those also support UniFi Protect, if you were to run UniFi Protect on those, and it's writing a lot of footage, that could potentially impact your throughput because you've got the same CPU handling your UniFi Protect and your network. But right now, that is really, really impressive. This device is completely happy routing full 10 gig. So there was a performance test of the Cloud Gateway Fiber. And as you could see, that was very, very impressive. I was very easily able to get speeds in excess of 8 to 9 gigabit a second, even with IDS and IPS enabled. Now, there's only one little catch I would just add in here, and that is that since I did those tests, Ubiquiti have just published the datasheet and spec page for the Cloud Gateway Fiber. And on that, they rate this as having IDS and IPS throughput of 5 gigabit. So even though in my testing here, I did get pretty significantly beyond that, personally, if you were looking to buy something like this, I would generally err on the side of caution and stick to around about what the datasheet claims. Just in case any future software updates or new features that got added brought the IDS and IPS throughput down potentially to around that 5 gigabit level, I would just be careful. So I would buy this if you're looking to really run IDS and IPS up to about 5 gig. But it's good to know that there's clearly plenty of headroom on it. And to be honest, a device at this price point, at this size and this nice little desktop form factor that can do 5 gig of IDS and IPS throughput is really, really impressive. Okay, so the final test I'm going to take a look at here is the Wi-Fi performance. And this is my first time properly testing Wi-Fi 7, and the speeds are a bit ridiculous. I've never seen Wi-Fi this fast. It's really, really impressive. So for my testing here, I'm going to be using the UDR7, but I've also previously tested the UniFi Express 7, and they both got round about the same Wi-Fi performance. So as before, we've got the UniFi UDR7 set up here, and once again, it's uplinked to my main network over 10 gig. You may think, if I'm doing Wi-Fi testing, why am I not using 2.5 gig? Well, actually, this can go beyond 2.5 gig Ethernet over Wi-Fi. It's that fast. So that is now set up there. So to do this testing, I'm going to be using my Framework laptop, and I've already upgraded the Wi-Fi card in this to an Intel BE200 Wi-Fi 7 card. And that's the thing to bear in mind with Wi-Fi 7. Very few devices support it yet, so you're going to have to be getting a very bleeding edge brand new device for it to have support for Wi-Fi 7. So it's still such a new standard. And then even after installing the Wi-Fi card, I had to update this to Windows 11 24H2, like the latest Windows 11 version, to even get support for multi-link operation for Wi-Fi 7. It was a lot of work to get this actually set up to do this test because it's such new technology. But if I run this test here, you'll see why I'm so amazed at the performance. So we'll start that running there. As you can see, straight up to beyond 2 gig. We are now downloading at about 2.3 gig. Yeah, 2.3 gig download. So of course that is base 2.4, so that's basically 2.5 gig Ethernet on the download side. And then wait for the upload to start. We are now uploading at about 3.2 gigabit, so actually uploading over Wi-Fi faster than 2.5 gig Ethernet, which is crazy to me. Now obviously the thing to bear in mind here is this is very much in an ideal dream world type scenario. I've got all my channel widths maxed out, I'm in a relatively quiet RF environment. If you're in a flat or an apartment building, you'd have potentially a lot more interference, and I am, well, not very far from the router. So off the back of that, I've done a few other performance tests, moving the laptop around between different rooms, kind of having the laptop in the same room, but the opposite corner of the room, kind of. So it's kind of simulating maybe having this in the corner of your living room, then you sitting on a laptop on the couch. I got about 1800 down and 2.6 gig up, so 1.8 gig down, 2.6 gig up, so still very impressive. Moving to the other side of this wall and across my hallway, the other side of this wall is my landing, so standing out on the landing through a wall, that got about 1.4 gig down, 1.7 gig up. Then going to the furthest corner of this floor, so a couple of rooms away with a couple of walls in between. Bear in mind these are all just plasterboard timber frame walls, they're not brick walls or anything. I got about 930 meg down and 1.2 gig up. So actually pretty impressive performance across a single floor of a house. But as soon as I went downstairs, the speeds absolutely tanked down to 390 meg down and up. So that's the thing with Wi-Fi 7 is its range is not as... the performance you get does not work over the sort of full range of your house. You very much need to be quite close to the access point. So especially with Wi-Fi 7, you're going to start needing to have more access points around the house just so you've kind of got very good close access to an access point, ideally line of sight. But that sort of performance it blew my mind. I mean, I'm not exaggerating when I say that. I got this working properly for the first time last night, and I spent an unreasonable amount of time just repeatedly running speed tests, just looking at it, just because I couldn't quite believe how fast it was going. The Wi-Fi performance of these devices is amazing, and I can't wait for Wi-Fi 7 to become more widely adopted and more devices to come out supporting it. Finally, I want to take a look at using the UniFi Express 7 as an access point, both as a wireless mesh extender and as a wired AP. So first up, we'll take a look at the wireless mesh option. So to set this up is actually extremely simple. In fact, I actually discovered it by accident because I was testing out the UDR7 and just had the UniFi Express 7 sitting off camera in a factory reset state. And it automatically shows up inside the UniFi network application. So if we come over here and take a look, you can see what we have here is in the UniFi network application, we have the UniFi devices list, and in here we see the UDR7 sitting there. Obviously, we're connected to UDR7, and we also have the UniFi Express 7 showing up ready to adopt. And as you can see right now, the UniFi Express 7 has no cables connected apart from power. It's completely wireless. So if we take this and we click adopt, that will start adopting. And then if we take a look over at the two devices, give it a second, it will begin the adopting process. So we'll give it a few minutes just for that to all take place and get everything to adopt, and then we'll take a look at it working. Okay, so that's now all adopted. So you can see in the UniFi network application, it says it's adopted, the uplink is mesh, and this is now working as a wireless mesh extender. So if you take a look at the front of the device, the screen's gone from the initial setup screen to now show a signal strength indicator, which will be the signal strength between this and the UDR7 it's connected to. And this is now going to be rebroadcasting all the appropriate Wi-Fi networks that are on the UDR7, and this will be somewhere else in your house repeating all that out. And it works really well. What's also neat with this is that with the Express 7 acting as a mesh extender, the two Ethernet ports on the back can then be used to connect additional wired devices. So for this setup here, what we have is we have the UDR7 that's connected to my upstream internet connection. That's also got the connection to the speed test server. This device is then connected to the UDR7 wirelessly, and then plugged into the back of that, we have my laptop. So we can run a speed test and test the speed of the wireless link between the two devices. So let's run that. With that there, we're seeing a speed of 1.3 gig down. And then 1.5, 1.7, about 2 gig up, 1.8, 2 gig up. So you'll notice this is a fair bit lower than the Wi-Fi 7 performance test we're taking a look at before. That's because currently the wireless meshing only uses the 5 GHz band, not the 6 GHz band. So it doesn't really get the full Wi-Fi 7 speeds that these devices are capable of. Hopefully they'll change that in the future and improve it, but even then this is still pretty decent performance. Now of course personally I would always much rather have all devices wired back to the central point rather than relying on wireless meshing, but it is really nice to see this working because in a lot of situations you just can't run cables or you don't want to, and you just want a decent wireless mesh system, and for that this is an absolutely great option. And if someone was sort of ever asking me about wanting a wireless mesh type setup, I'd be really tempted to go down the UniFi route, just because you're getting known good UniFi hardware that works with lots of other UniFi products, rather than going for a more consumer off-the-shelf mesh system. This works really, really well, and if they can add the 6 GHz band into the meshing connection, that would be even better. Okay, and so the final test I want to do is I want to now try and connect the UniFi Express 7 up as a wired access point to the UDR7, and that works too. So what I've done here is I've connected one of the network ports on the Express 7 directly into one of the LAN ports on the UDR7. Now that's just what I've done for this testing. You could easily have that connection going through multiple switches and all kind of other switching infrastructure. But if you look back in the UniFi network application here, once again, it shows up as ready to adopt. So we can press to adopt there and then wait a few minutes and that will now adopt over a wired uplink. And there we go, that's now set up and working. So it's now adopted into the UniFi network application, and if you take a look at the front of the UniFi Express, rather than showing that signal strength indicator it showed before, it now just shows a 2.5 gig uplink and just general sort of throughput information. That screen also rotates, so if you tilt it around, it kind of rotates based on the angle it's at, which is actually quite a nice little feature if you did want to kind of somewhat mount this or position this at a funny angle. But yeah, that is now set up and working as a wired access point. And I could actually see this being a really nice use case of the UniFi Express devices, because in a lot of situations, you don't really want to mount an access point. Now sure, in my house here, or a house that's got a complicated wired network where people really care about the networking, sure, sticking some UniFi access points on the ceiling and things like that is the best way to go. But in a lot of sort of residential settings, you might not want to be physically mounting access points. And in my opinion, the Express form factor is actually a really nice form factor for having an access point that just wants to sit on a table, sit on a shelf, sit on like a little sideboard, something like that, compared to taking a regular UniFi access point and kind of leaving it flat on a table that always looks a little bit silly. So this could actually be a really, really nice option, and I would definitely bear this in mind if you're ever looking for a UniFi access point that you want to be able to just sit on a table rather than mount somewhere. Now of course the downside of this is that it does require an external power supply. This doesn't support PoE power, but it is still a really nice option to consider. And then what you can also do in this setup is obviously you'll have one of the network connections on this connected back to your upstream router or the rest of your network, but the other Ethernet port on the Express 7 is also usable as a LAN port, so I've plugged the laptop into that, and we can run a speed test, and because we're connected at 2.5 gig on both these interfaces, yep, we're able to happily hit 2.5 gig wire speed through the UniFi Express 7. So this means that again, if you only had maybe one cable going between two rooms in your house or something like that, you could put a UniFi Express 7 in as an access point and then come off of that either into a single device or into a switch. It would work really well. There's only one thing to bear in mind if you want to use the Ethernet ports on the Express 7 when it's set up as an access point, both as a wired access point or a wireless mesh extender. And that is that when you're wanting to use the wired ports to connect downstream devices, you can't configure any kind of VLANs on that. So if you've got multiple networks or VLANs set up in UniFi, you can't decide which of those are assigned to those ports. They just kind of operate using your default network or your default VLAN. That's probably fine for a lot of situations, a lot of sort of domestic settings where you're maybe only going to have one network. But it's just something to bear in mind if you did want to have your network heavily segregated into a bunch of different VLANs. If you wanted to use the wired ports on a UniFi Express acting as a mesh extender or an extra access point, they're only going to work on your default network. Hopefully that's something that could be changed in the future, because it'd be really nice if you could come into here and maybe reassign those ports to different VLANs, but right now they just will operate on your default VLAN. So there you have it. That was a look at these 3 new UniFi Cloud Gateway devices. And I absolutely love these. These are such great little devices. They're all quite different from each other, but I can definitely see really interesting use cases for each of them. UniFi Express 7 would be great for very small environments where maybe you're kind of just wanting to replace or get something in line with a consumer mesh system, but getting into the UniFi ecosystem. However, it would also work brilliantly as a sort of desktop style access point. So for situations where you don't want to mount an access point, you want something that can just sit on a table, or you want it to mesh to an existing UniFi system, be it another UniFi Express, or UDR, or full-on UniFi access points. This can act as a great little mesh extender. It's just a really, really neat little device, and this form factor is absolutely lovely. Next up, you've got the UDR7. This is an absolutely great option for people who just kind of want an all-in-one router. They want to just replace their ISP's router or some other sort of consumer-grade router with something a lot better. You can get something like this. You've got full UniFi ecosystem in this. You can easily expand it with UniFi switches, additional UniFi access points, have all that additional UniFi hardware, and start off with this little device. Don't need anything to rack mount. You can just sit on a table and do everything. And then both of these have the built-in Wi-Fi, which is absolutely fantastic. Of course, with Wi-Fi 7 and the 6 GHz band, you are going to start needing multiple access points around a building. You couldn't really have one of these in the corner of a large house and have it cover the entire house with super high-speed Wi-Fi. But of course, with the ability to add an Express 7 to your UDR7, that could work really well. And then finally, you've got the Cloud Gateway Fiber, which is quite a bit different to the other two, given it's not got built-in Wi-Fi and it's got, multiple 10 gig ports, and it's generally designed for a sort of higher end environment. But I could see this being really useful in sort of small offices, little branch office type things, places where maybe you've not got a full-on wired infrastructure, you've not got a comms rack, you've maybe just got, just laptops and stuff around a room, maybe some basic cabling in going to like a small patch panel or a few wall ports. Something like this where you've maybe not got a comms rack, but you can have one of these, maybe a separate switch just sitting on a table or a shelf, all working together. These devices are absolutely brilliant. So yeah, that was a look at these new products, and I absolutely love them. I really can't wait to sort of see more use cases for these and find out situations where I can use these. But yeah, these are absolutely brilliant little devices, and it was really fun to try them out. And it was also really exciting trying out Wi-Fi 7, because this is my first time experiencing it, and I'm still quite blown away by the performance. Being able to basically exceed 2.5 gig Ethernet over Wi-Fi is still kind of mind-boggling to me. But yeah, hope you found this interesting or useful if you're looking at buying these. And if you are interested in buying any of these, I'll put some links in the description and in a pinned comment. But all that's left to say now is thank you very much for watching.